It happened in one night. A nation voted, and then it vanished. At exactly 7:16 p.m., Tanzania disappeared from the digital map. Screens froze, radios went silent, and a heartbeat that once carried the rhythm of East Africa stopped mid-sentence. In Dar es Salaam, firelight replaced streetlights, and silence replaced the law. For millions, this was not the loss of signal, but the loss of self, because when a nation is silenced, its people learn what freedom truly costs. Out of that darkness came a single message, fragile yet unbreakable. If I disappear, tell my mother I voted. It traveled further than any headline, cutting through borders and fear alike, until it became a symbol whispered from one trembling heart to another. That was the moment the world should have understood this was no glitch of politics. It was a test of faith, a warning written in silence. And somewhere within that silence, the spark of defiance flickered again, an Ibrahim Traoré moment, when youth and conscience rose above obedience and called power by its name. So if you believe stories like this must be told, subscribe now, because silence only wins when we stop speaking. It began before sunset, quietly, like a storm rehearsing its arrival. The streets of Dar es Salaam were restless but restrained. Vendors packed early, soldiers stood at corners pretending not to watch, and the air carried the taste of coming rain. By 6 o'clock, the government's message echoed from loudspeakers mounted on police trucks. For your safety, remain indoors. But everyone knew what those words really meant: obey or disappear. As the curfew spread across the city, people hurried home clutching their ID cards like prayer beads, whispering that the election would still mean something if they could just reach the ballot box before the lights went out. Asha was one of them. She was 23, a university student who had never seen a free election in her lifetime, but still believed in one. She arrived before dawn, holding her mother's umbrella against the coastal rain. Because I was raised to believe my voice counts, she told the reporter waiting outside. Hours later, that voice would vanish into static. By late afternoon, the tension thickened. Videos of police seizing ballot boxes appeared online, then disappeared even faster. In the northern towns of Arusha and Mwanza, whole neighborhoods were turned away from polling stations. A radio host named Joseph tried to stay cheerful on his morning show. "Let's show the world that Tanzania still believes in democracy," he said. But by dusk his signal had faded, swallowed by the same silence creeping through every frequency. Mama Rahima, who sold fruit in the Kariakou market, looked up at the sky and whispered, "The drums sound different." She remembered another election long ago, when her husband danced in the streets after independence. This time there was no music. Then came the flickers. First the streetlights, then the phones, then the screens. Across the harbor, the glow of the city began to die one block at a time. At 7:16 p.m., NetBlocks confirmed what millions already felt: the entire nation had gone dark. No calls, no messages, no witnesses. The blackout wasn't an accident. It was a design. In one breathless hour, democracy was disconnected. The government called it temporary security. The people called it what it was: erasure. Inside the Muhimbili National Hospital, nurses worked by flashlight. A doctor told African News, "We cut bandages until the floor turned red, and then the power went out." In the district of Kigamboni, Asha's mother dialed every number she knew. Each one went straight to silence. In another part of the city, Private Musa, a 19-year-old soldier, stood near the ferry terminal, his rifle trembling in his hands. "They told us the protesters were traitors," he whispered later, "but they looked like my friends." That was the moment he realized obedience could also be violence. By nightfall, smoke coiled above the city like an unfinished prayer. Armored trucks blocked the intersections and tear gas stung the air. The streets emptied, not from peace but from fear. And yet, through the hum of generators and the throb of distant sirens, one message kept moving, Asha's words, carried by screenshots, by memory, by faith. If I disappear, tell my mother I voted. It reached beyond the blackout, past the borders of Tanzania, to people who understood that silence is never neutral. That night, the world saw Tanzania vanish from the grid. But for those who lived through it, the disappearance was not digital, it was human. It was the sound of democracy taking its last breath before the dawn. And in that breath, a question rose that no government could censor. If light can vanish in one night, what else can? Silence has a sound. It hums beneath closed doors, it lingers between breaths, and on that night in Tanzania, it roared louder than any siren. When the internet died, 1,000 conversations died with it. Messages froze mid-sentence, files unsent, voices trapped inside machines. It was not only communication that vanished, but the proof that people had existed at all. Across the city, power returned in fragments, one bulb glowing here, one radio crackling there, but the signal of trust was gone. Tanzania had entered a new kind of night, one where silence itself became a form of rule. For 64 years, the ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM, had promised peace and progress. Its green banners fluttered on every street, its slogans painted across walls that no one dared to challenge. Once, CCM stood for liberation, born from the dream of unity and freedom. But dreams, when owned too long, harden into property. What began as a promise became a possession. The state, the media, the market, each was a branch of the same tree, roots tangled so deep that no one remembered where the forest began. Power had become invisible, inevitable, absolute. Inside government offices, officials spoke of stability. On paper, the laws looked clean: security acts, media regulations, registration requirements. But each clause was a quiet command: obey or vanish. Journalists learned to write without names, activists to whisper instead of shout, professors to edit themselves before lecturing. Freedom was not taken all at once. It was chipped away, politely, in the language of order. Control arrived softly, wearing the mask of safety. At the Muhimbili hospital, nurses moved through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. The lights flickered, then failed. One nurse, too afraid to give her name, told a foreign reporter, "We treated the wounded until the floor turned red. Then the power went out, and we kept working in the dark." She said it without anger, only exhaustion, the sound of duty surviving after hope has left. In the marketplace of Kariakou, Mama Rahima sat beside her stall of fruit gone rotten, her radio silent. She looked at the empty street and murmured, "They say order has returned, but I cannot hear it." For people like her, silence was not peace. It was paralysis. Across town, a taxi driver named Joseph broke curfew to ferry the wounded. He drove through alleys with headlights off, guided only by memory and faith. When the last of his messages failed to send, he kept driving anyway, saying later, "If I stopped, someone might die." So I drove blind. Private Musa, stationed near the port, could still hear the ocean. Its waves were the only honest sound left. He thought about the people he'd been told to fear, the ones waving flags, the ones shouting for fairness. They didn't look like traitors. They looked like him. We were defending the nation, his commander said. But Musa wondered which nation, the one on paper or the one in pain. By midnight, Tanzania had been erased from every global feed. Screens across Africa flickered to black. Experts at Access Now called it digital authoritarianism. Others simply called it the new face of control. Cameroon, Sudan, Ethiopia, they had all gone dark before, and each time the world called it a domestic issue. Each time, silence was mistaken for peace. And yet, under that silence, something was stirring. The young who had grown up on satire and smartphones refused to inherit fear. They built VPNs faster than sensors could block them. They passed messages hand to hand, phone to phone, hope to hope. Freedom was not dead. It had simply gone underground, waiting for the dawn. Because even in the stillness, the conscience of a people cannot be switched off. And as the night deepened, a truth began to echo through the quiet corridors and shuttered markets. Silence is not safety. It is surrender. But when surrender becomes survival, how long before the living remember what it means to be free? Dawn did not arrive in triumph. It crept in softly, as if afraid of what it might see. The smoke still hung above Dar es Salaam like a second sky. The streets were carpeted with broken glass and torn posters soaked in rain. The night had ended, but the silence had not. Tanzania woke up, but the world it opened its eyes to was not the same. Democracy had stopped breathing. The government called it order. The people called it loss. At the Kariakoo market, Mama Rahima stood behind the charred remains of her stall. The fruit had spoiled, the customers were gone, and her radio once, her link to the world, was now just static. She brushed the ashes off her hands and said softly, "We open every day to survive. Now even silence has a price." Her words drifted through the market like a sermon no one wanted to hear. Across town, Sarah, a schoolteacher, walked through an empty corridor where the drawings of her pupils still clung to the walls. She paused by a poster that read, "Democracy means choice." The ink had run down with the rain. "Yesterday," she said, "they learned it means fear." That single line carried more truth than any official report. In the district of Kigamboni, Asha's mother moved from hospital to hospital, photo in hand, hope thinning with every step. "Have you seen this girl?" she asked again and again. No one had. The nurses shook their heads. "We have no list," one said, "only faces." Her shoes stuck to the wet pavement as she crossed streets that smelled of smoke and salt. The whole city seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for a name that never came. Meanwhile, the hospitals counted the wounded in whispers. Power was unstable, supplies short. A volunteer at Muhimbili wiped the floors still stained from the night before. "We have no record of names," he said quietly. "Only the bodies we could not save." Each syllable landed like a tolling bell, a requiem for the uncounted. In the ports, soldiers stood with rifles but empty eyes. The curfew had turned to routine. "They say it's peace," one murmured, "but it feels like mourning." For many, the hardest sound to bear was not the siren, but the absence of one. Even the ocean seemed quieter, as though afraid to echo what it had heard. Economists later said the 72-hour lockdown cost Tanzania nearly $24 million in lost trade. Trucks stopped at the Zambian border, fish spoiled on the coast, cargo rotted under the sun. But that number meant nothing compared to what could not be counted. The silence in classrooms, the fear in markets, the tears behind shuttered doors. Because the real price of silence is not measured in money. It is measured in memory. Private Musa sat on a crate by the port, watching the sky turn the color of old ash. He had not slept since the blackout. They told us we were defending the nation, he said. But that night, I saw the nation cry. His words joined the growing chorus of quiet confession soldiers, nurses, teachers, each one discovering that obedience had turned them into witnesses. When evening returned, the television screens lit up with the government's message. Order has been restored, but order built on fear is not peace. It is paralysis disguised as calm. And the people knew it. You could see it in their eyes, hear it in the way they spoke only in half sentences, always looking over their shoulders. Tanzania had survived the night, but something within it had died, the belief that silence meant safety. Yet even as despair settled over the city, a whisper began to move again through the alleys and the markets, a fragile defiance refusing to fade. It said, "We are still here, and where there is presence, there is possibility." The silence that swallowed Tanzania did not stop at its borders. It drifted north across the plains, west across the lakes, east across the sea. In Nairobi, students gathered outside the university gates holding cardboard signs that read, "If Tanzania falls, who stands next?" In Lagos, a musician turned Asha's final words into a song. In Johannesburg, an old activist lit a candle and whispered, "We've heard this silence before." The blackout had traveled farther than any broadcast. It had become a mirror, reflecting the fears of an entire continent. Across Africa, people recognized the pattern. They had seen it in Cameroon in 2017, in Sudan in 2021, in Ethiopia 2 years later. Curfew, arrests, blackout. Each time governments called it national security. Each time the world called it a domestic issue. But the people called it what it truly was, a fear of truth. And yet, from that fear rose something stronger. Civil groups in Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda began calling for an African Bill of Digital Rights, a covenant for the modern age, where connection is not a luxury, but a lifeline. They demanded laws that protect the right to speak even when governments choose not to listen. Activists began to link their struggles across borders, forming digital communities of resistance. Because the internet may die, but ideas do not. In Burkina Faso, young people drew inspiration from a familiar defiance. When they saw how Tanzanian youth faced silence with courage, many called it an Ibrahim Traoré reaction, that moment when truth confronts fear, when conviction outweighs caution. It became a phrase of pride whispered from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. This is our time to remember we are not alone. For Africa's youth, who make up 70% of the continent, freedom is not theory, it is oxygen. And when that oxygen grows thin, rebellion becomes breath. In their art, in their code, in their chants. A generation born in connection refused to inherit silence. They painted their hope on walls, coded it into apps, sang it into the wind. The African Union said nothing. The great powers watched politely. But underneath that official quiet, the ground was shifting. Because silence may cover nations, but it cannot contain memory. The whisper that began in Dar es Salaam had become a chorus, no, a continent, breathing as one, waiting for dawn. And when that dawn comes, who will rise to meet it? The leaders who feared their people, or the people who finally stopped being afraid? Dawn came quietly to Dar es Salaam. The sea shimmered pale blue, as if the ocean itself had been waiting to breathe again. After 3 days of darkness, the first signal flickered back to life. One by one, phones buzzed awake, screens lighting up like small resurrections. In the city's heart, a mother walked through streets that still smelled of smoke and rain. Her name was never broadcast, but her image would outlive every headline. Asha's mother, carrying a single photograph pressed against her chest, searching not for answers, but for remembrance. She passed burnt posters, melted asphalt, soldiers who no longer spoke. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The nation itself seemed to bow as she walked. At that same moment, somewhere in the web of returning signals, a message surfaced from the dark. If I disappear, tell my mother I voted. It appeared first on one phone, then 100, then 1,000. It traveled faster than before, freer than before, untouched by censorship or control. Within minutes, it was everywhere on timelines, on walls, in songs, in prayers. It no longer belonged to one girl. It belonged to a generation. In Nairobi, students painted those words in red on university walls. In Lagos, a gospel choir sang them to the rhythm of drums. In Johannesburg, an old man whispered them into a microphone before a crowd of candles. The blackout that was meant to erase a people had illuminated a truth. Control can silence a crowd, but it cannot silence a conscience. Private Musa sat by the port watching the sunrise spill across the water. The city was still scarred, but the light did not hesitate to return. They told us we were protecting peace, he said softly. But peace without justice is just a longer night. He turned off his radio and listened not to commands, but to the sound of waves meeting shore, each one a reminder that even silence breaks eventually. Across Tanzania, markets reopened, radios played again, children laughed for the first time in days. Yet under that fragile routine, something new stirred a shared understanding that peace built on fear is not peace at all, only pause, and that pause was ending. Because when a nation learns to speak again after silence, its first word is never obedience, it is truth. History has a way of whispering before it shouts. The blackout that swallowed Tanzania was meant to erase a moment, but instead, it revealed a generation. It showed that even in silence, the human spirit keeps speaking. For decades, Tanzania was praised as a pillar of stability in East Africa, a nation that endured. But endurance without justice is not strength, it is sleep. And on that night, the country finally woke up. Across the continent, people recognized the rhythm of this awakening. They called it an Ibrahim Traoré moment, a heartbeat of courage, the instant when fear gives way to faith. It was not just about Tanzania. It was about every place where freedom had been rationed, every community told to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Because peace without truth is a prison built from polite words. As the story traveled beyond borders, it became something larger than politics. It became prophecy. In sermons, in classrooms, in the quiet rooms of old men and women who had marched before, that message was repeated. Silence is never peace. It was the same energy that once moved Selma's bridge, that once filled the streets of Soweto, that now moves through fiber optics and firewalls alike. The same conviction, the same pulse, the same refusal to forget. That is the legacy of an Ibrahim Traoré moment. When ordinary people, under extraordinary pressure, remember they are not powerless. And to those watching from afar, those who felt the tremor of this awakening in their own chests, it became an Ibrahim Traoré reaction, a spark of recognition that the struggle is shared, the light is shared, and so is the duty to keep it burning. So if you still believe that silence is not peace, if you still believe that light must return, share this story. If you believe that truth deserves a voice, subscribe and speak. Because freedom does not arrive when permitted, It rises when remembered. And somewhere tonight, in another city, another nation, another darkness, a voice is preparing to rise again.